Hey there, this is Heather Van Wild with Raindrop Works. Just have an opportunity to go over some documentation that I found just a little bit ago and thought it might be an interesting read. Apologies in advance for the mess behind me, and if there's outside noise, it's just one of those nights. I didn't plan this. I don't have all my stuff fully set up. But yeah, so let's just, this was filed earlier today in federal court. This is in regards to the 2012 lawsuit filed by the Department of Justice against the City of Portland for their, suffice to say, poor policing habits. Especially dealing with people in mental health crises and use of force, things like that. They were surprisingly... Sorry, I'm finding out my volume was just a little too high. So finding out that they were in substantial compliance with the law, with the settlement that was being worked on about a year and a half ago. In light of the George Floyd protests, that drastically changed. I looked at the first few paragraphs before I realized this was something that would probably be better as a cold read. And it really does feel like it's coming down to the city is grading themselves on their class project. This is going to be gone more in depth, presumably on Tuesday. That's what the current court docket is set up for. A full day hearing with breaks scheduled and everything. I'm going to try to see if I can sit in virtually on that hearing. I'm still waiting to hear back from the court about how to do that, and I'm hoping to hear back from them tomorrow or something soon on that. So let's go ahead and go into this now. This is the United States District Court in the District of Oregon, Portland Division. Honestly, we only have one district court in Oregon, so I'm not sure why they said Portland Division. That's the first time I've seen it. Anyway, this is the City of Portland's memorandum for the 5th Status Conference. Introduction. The City of Portland, the city, is committed to public safety reform and the goal of changing its systems and institutions to better serve all members of our community. Yeah, how's that going for you? The settlement agreement between the city and the United States is part of this commitment to change, with particular focus under the agreement on change for policing of individuals with perceived or actual mental illness or those experiencing a mental health crisis. It's worth pointing out that from April to now, we have had 3 officer-involved shootings where cops shot people that were experiencing mental health crises or had perceived or actual mental health issues, and they killed 2 of them. So on the surface, I don't know that this is going as well as you would hope, as you would like to say it is. In January 2020, the United States found the city in substantial compliance in all areas of the settlement agreement. While the city began the year in substantial compliance, the COVID-19 pandemic struck in March 2020 and caused significant changes to how people in the city lived and worked. Technically true, not really an excuse. In May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered by police in Minnesota, and people across the nation and the world began demonstrating to advance the racial justice movement. True. Portland saw many demonstrations throughout the summer of 2020 and into the early winter, with the deployment of additional federal law enforcement personnel to Portland in July 2020, contributing in part to a prolonged and difficult situation. You don't get to pin this on the feds. Portland police were being plenty brutal all on their own, as I and dozens of journalists and hundreds of protesters have personally, physically felt. And that's without counting what the federal agents had done. In February 2021, the United States found the city no longer in substantial compliance in 4 of the 9 sections of the settlement agreement. Section 3, use of force, Section 4, training, Section 8, officer accountability, and Section 9, community engagement and creation of Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing. The city's work related to the remaining areas of the settlement agreement reflected success. The United States found the city continued in substantial compliance in Section 5, community-based mental health services, Section 6, crisis intervention, and Section 7, employee information system. I have recently heard some criticisms of the community-based mental health services section, which may be getting brought up in court on Tuesday. The claims that I've seen have basically been that what is set up is not the walk-in / drop-off system that the federal courts wanted for how to deal with people in mental health, and what's in its place has gotten the kind of the blessing of the courts, but is inadequate. The city has also done substantial work in standing up the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, and renews its motion for the court to formally recognize the hard work of this committee and grant final approval to the 2017 amendments. The PCCEP deserves an established and approved framework that sets forth its authority and its responsibilities as it undertakes its challenging and important work. The PCCEP and the parties also need the clarity of knowing that the terms they must meet to achieve compliance as it relates to the PCCEP are settled. This is a section that I am not familiar with. It seems like at the very least the city wants to verify, what are the expectations that they're asking for. And that does seem to be valid. Whether community engaged policing is a phrase that can be problematic depending on how it's being used, and I definitely invite those who have more information to speak up in the comments here on Twitter or whatever to get the news out with their experiences. So then we go on to areas of partial compliance. The United States found the city in only partial compliance but no longer in substantial compliance in 4 areas of the settlement agreement: use of force, training, officer accountability, and community engagement. The city is actively working to regain substantial compliance in those critical areas. Number 1, use of force. Under the use of force section of the settlement agreement, the United States found that some of the uses of force that occurred during the nightly crowd control events between May 29th and November 15th did not comport with the requirements of this settlement agreement. So that's almost 6 months that they're acknowledging, or they're acknowledging the state said they were out of compliance. I suspect that November 15th date was the cutoff on the research that the outside organization that is monitoring compliance, that was probably the date when they stopped evaluating stuff for the report that they filed in the initial report in December of 2020, and then the final report that they're referencing here in February of 2021. The United States and the city agree that there were issues with the use of force during crowd control events in 2020. There were sometimes misapplications and violations of the use of force policy. Sometimes. Only sometimes. The city's review of use of force reports, the after-action report, did not always meet the requirements of the agreement or policy. Some were not done within the timelines required by the settlement agreement. There were AARs where the supervisor did not perform the required thorough investigation. There were times where there were misunderstandings of the law and policy related to use of force in crowd control situations. And this is on top of court orders signed by the same judge overseeing this case, Judge Simon, in the Don't Shoot and Index newspapers federal lawsuits that aim to further restrict the use of force because we knew that they were being so bad at managing their use of force. Over the course of protests in 2020, the Portland Police Bureau attempted to redress the shortcomings in the system. Portland Police specifically assigned sergeants to act as after-action supervisors rather than requiring supervisors who were on scene for hours on end, day after day, to review and assess uses of force. While this helped somewhat with the timeliness of after-action investigations, other issues remain. I feel like that could be part of the problem if you have sergeants instead of commanders who weren't out there, didn't have that experience. I'm not sure how useful that is in a case like this. After the protests of 2020, Portland Police developed strategies to better ensure timely and thorough investigation of uses of force. Portland Police requires that even in crowd control situations, when there are uses of force, the assigned after-action sergeant's interview of the involved officer and witnesses occur before they are released at the end of their shift, even if the officers have been on duty for several hours or for multiple days. Yeah. Witnesses interviewed. I have, to this date, never heard of a witness being interviewed by Portland Police after use of force at a protest. The closest would be when they have arrested people and they're being booked into county jail, but you can't interview them as witnesses because you're trying to charge them with crime and they have a Fifth Amendment right to prevent self-incrimination. Now, additionally, officers working protest events will, in most circumstances, not do so for more than 10 consecutive days. Yeah. 10 on, 4 off? Is that how they're doing? Obviously, the rapid response team was overworked. If they were working 10 days in a row and, having to use all this force that they had to stay after all these hours to do paperwork, I really don't expect that to have actually happened. The information was shared with Portland Police members to help address the misunderstandings of law and policy, and these issues will be addressed more thoroughly in a training that starts September 1st. I suspect this training is one of the ones that came forward as a result of contempt sanctions in one of the other lawsuits, where, among other things, Brett Taylor got basically kicked off the rapid response team because of his multiple City Council provided Portland Police with fundings to purchase Office 365, which includes SharePoint and can be used to better track force reports and AAR for timeliness. One of their old arguments was that they were using an older version of Office and it didn't have the interconnectivity that newer versions do. The city is also giving serious consideration to body-worn cameras, which will assist with the thoroughness of reviews of use of forces with accountability. Body-worn cameras is a thing that the federal government, the DOJ, is really pushing for. It's part of the ongoing contract negotiations with the police bureau. The Portland Police Association wants to have primary control over those videos. We have seen historically that body-worn cameras don't do a lot for improving documentation and accountability of police misconduct. I've seen videos where police can turn their body if they're doing something where the camera can't pick up what they're doing, or they selectively turn the cameras on or off. We don't seem to... I haven't seen a reliable way to safely handle 24/7 body cameras without also running into issues of personal privacy for victims and members of the public that are not subject to police interactions. So there is that to be concerned about. The city is exploring other avenues to further review and assess the events of 2020 so as to provide more information about what went wrong and how to best remedy these issues going forward. But at this point, nothing that we've seen suggests that they're actually doing anything. We've seen Mayor Wheeler go against massive public outcry asking for support of Portland Street Response, which is currently in its pilot phase. It is that program is still expanding itself now, but could very easily have been beneficial for some of the instances where we've had police shooting people in mental health. I mean, not necessarily related to the 2020 protests, but we also haven't seen him do anything towards actually holding the police accountable. The police are running their own PR campaigns to try to discredit the mayor. It really seems like the city has no real control of the police. Then they move on to training. Portland Police developed a training program that was found in substantial compliance in early 2020. In the fall of each year, the Portland Police Training Division performs a needs assessment from the prior year that informs the training schedule for the following year. Portland Police may add other trainings throughout the year as necessary, but the needs assessment provides Portland Police with information to guide the decision-making around the issues that are ultimately calendared for the following year. The specifics of the needs assessment is detailed in paragraph 79 of the settlement agreement. There were several paragraphs under the training section of the settlement agreement where the city maintained substantial compliance. Unfortunately, training also suffered as a result of the events of 2020. One key component of the settlement agreement's training section is the requirement for scenario-based training, in addition to traditional lecture-based training. Scenario-based training requires in-person practice of situations officers may face in the field. While all Portland Police members received their required annual lecture-based training, this training moved to a virtual format after March 2020. Only about half of Portland Police members received their annual scenario-based training since it was not finished when the pandemic broke out. This has been a known issue for some time. Basically, since everyone was doing work from home and trying to minimize in-person contact. A lot of things, yeah. So, as COVID-19 hit in full force, the city moved to virtual and telework as work allowed, limiting in-person contact to the extent possible. In-person training halted. In-person training was delayed until 2021. As of the end of May 2021, the scenario-based training originally scheduled for 2020 finally concluded, and the city redressed the training compliance issue from 2020. It looks like they're saying they're back on track, and this was only a momentary hiccup because of the pandemic. They don't seem to be trying to blame the protests on this, even though I'm pretty sure we saw reports in the early months of the protests where there were officers that had not, or that were out of compliance with their training, that were misusing their weapons. Officer accountability. For the most part, the city remained in substantial compliance in this section of the United States Compliance Report. Portland Police's Internal Affairs Division continued to complete a high percentage of its investigations within the 180-day required timeline. However, the timeliness of investigations by the Independent Police Review suffered, and as well the city was no longer in substantial compliance for officer accountability. The United States raised a few concerns with officer accountability that were addressed at that time. Now, as a reminder, the Independent Police Review, that is a civilian oversight committee that historically has not had the power that people want it to have. We did have a ballot measure last fall that was passed seeking to scrap the current IPR and replace it with a more robust oversight program that actually has teeth and can hold officers accountable. They do go on to note, in regard to officer accountability, concerns raised by the United States that were not timeliness of investigations. These issues often involve circumstances of first impression. In one instance, an officer struck someone in the head and contended it was unintentional. The matter was sent to Internal Affairs for investigation to determine if it was excessive. However, the provisions of the Deadly Force Directive were not immediately implemented, as the force was reported as unintentional, and only intentional head strikes are considered deadly force under the Deadly Force Directive. This particular incident I remember from the protests. I can't remember now if it was a protester or a journalist, but got shoved, got hit in the head with a baton, I believe, and they claimed it was not lethal force because it was an accident. The organization that is monitoring compliance said, no, this is clearly deadly force. You messed up your investigation. And it was supposed to go back and get reevaluated as deadly force. They go on to say, once a question arose about the intentionality of the strike, the United States and the city engaged in discussion and agreed to implement the provisions of the Deadly Force Directive. Part of the issue related to the fact that the provisions of the Deadly Force Directive focus on actions Bureau members must take at the scene of a deadly force incident, and those actions are not transferable when the event is determined to be deadly force days after the incident. In other words, they have to do extra work right away if there's deadly force, and because they misclassified it, they didn't get that work done at the time. The directive for assessing whether the use of force is excessive is the same whether deadly or non-lethal force is used, so accountability still exists. They just got to it from a different way. Like Portland Police, IPR was impacted by COVID-19 and the protests. The number of complaints filed with IPR increased significantly during the protests of 2020, and IPR simply did not have the staff to handle the influx of investigations. I wonder why. Why, oh why, could they have had a sudden influx in complaints about police abusing protesters? Additionally, many complaints were based on video that did not provide the name of the person impacted by the use of force. IPR made valiant efforts to find those impacted by uses of force. Sometimes their efforts were successful, and other times they were not. In either instance, the time spent trying to find people caused significant delays in investigations. And that could be safety concerns. While victims of police brutality are supposed to be kept anonymous, I have heard of instances where names have accidentally gotten released under records requests for various reasons, and given the political nature that came about because of these protests, it's understandable that people may be hesitant to say, yeah, I was the one who got attacked. Then they go on to say, in response to concerns raised by the United States, the auditor who oversees IPR temporarily moves staff to IPR from other divisions in her office to help with the backlog of cases. IPR has resolved the majority of this backlog. A few matters remain outstanding, but the settlement agreement provides for a tolling of the timeline in many of those instances. Looking prospectively, the vast majority of cases are timely. By my understanding, IPR has been consistently underfunded. There's also concerns of the impartiality of the auditor, and that could actually bode poorly for, staff being moved to the IPR from other divisions, bringing a bias to the IPR that could be problematic. The United States also raised concerns about the new Community Police Oversight Board and how to transition from IPR to this board will occur. This is the one, and they go on to say, in November 2020, the voters of Portland amended the city charter to provide for a community oversight board for certain police misconduct cases. This is the replacement for the IPR that we're working on. In July 2021, Council adopted a resolution creating a commission tasked with writing the procedures, powers, definitions, and other details of the Oversight Board. The resolution further provided that the commission will perform this task over the course of 18 months. So basically through the entirety of 2022. The commission will report its recommendations to City Council. City Council will then make a final determination as to the various aspects of the Oversight Board. Thereafter, the city will start the process of finding members for the Oversight Board and of staffing investigators and others to serve the needs of Portland. So, yeah, it doesn't look like this is going to be cleared up anytime soon. If IPR was a significant part of the consent decree, then this could very well push it out for another couple of years until we prove that the new oversight board is able to be in compliance. The United States raised concerns about the transition from IPR to the Oversight Board. The city was already in the process of addressing concerns regarding existing IPR staff and their roles leading up to and after the transition to an Oversight Board, and its adopted budget for fiscal years 2021 to 2022, noting that the fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th. City Council committed to funding the existing positions through the transition of the Oversight Board. Council also agreed in a budget note to find equivalent positions for IPR staff within the city so they would not fear they would no longer be employed once the new Oversight Board was implemented. So even if they don't make it to the Oversight Board, no one is getting fired from the city. The city continues to work to find suitable solutions to other concerns that IPR staff have about their future so as to maintain their vital work during the transition. Let me go on to community engagement. The last area where the United States found the city no longer in substantial compliance is community engagement. Under paragraph 150 of the settlement agreement, Portland Police issues a publicly available annual report and then holds a meeting in each precinct and at a city council meeting annually. Portland Police has 3 precincts, North, East, and Central. In 2020, Portland presented the annual report to city council and presented it at 2 precinct meetings, but did not present it at the 3rd precinct. With a claim here that the nightly protests and a COVID outbreak impacted the ability to hold it at the 3rd precinct. Not clarifying when they were trying to, if this was just because all the meetings were, virtually or canceled, or if there was a particular date that they weren't able to and they just never rescheduled. I feel like there's information missing there. Portland Police committed to presenting the annual report earlier the following year, and Mayor Wheeler acknowledged the need for this. In 2021, Portland Police scheduled presentation of the annual report to City Council on August 18th, 2021. That was on Wednesday, and scheduled presentation at the precincts for August 17th, 18th, and 19th. The city is committed to presentation of the annual report at all required locations each year by the end of summer and does not anticipate future problems with this. This is the first that I heard. Apparently, we missed the presentation of the annual report. The last one was last night, and yeah, I missed that one. Then they go on to brief about areas of substantial compliance. First one referencing community-based mental health services, crisis intervention, and the employee information system. Stating they maintain substantial compliance under the settlement agreement in 3 areas: community-based mental health services, crisis intervention, and EIS, or employee information systems. In the area of community-based mental health services, the city remained in substantial compliance. Portland Police's Behavioral Health Unit continues to work closely with outside entities to help provide addictions and mental health services to those in need. Portland Police works with several other stakeholders, or individuals or organizations, in various committees to continually assess and address the needs of those interested supportive services for addiction and mental health. The city also remained in substantial compliance for its implementation of the employee information system. EIS is used to track data and provides information of trends or patterns of behavior that need attention. I'm not fully sure, but it feels like they're talking about like there's misconduct that it's being documented and tracked now. But that's something that under current law we'll never see because it's exempt from disclosure under FOIA laws. Under the crisis intervention system, there are a number of requirements, all of which the city continued to maintain substantial compliance. The city continues, as required by the settlement agreement, the Behavioral Health Unit and the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Committee. As noted by the United States in its compliance report, the BHU exemplifies the city's effort to coordinate law enforcement activity with the broader behavioral health system to aid people in crises resulting from known or suspected mental illness and or addictions. And this was from the page 32 of the compliance report that was filed earlier in the year. The city also continues to ensure that all officers are trained in crisis intervention. Some officers undertake additional training in crisis intervention, i.e. enhanced crisis intervention training, and these officers are part of a team that are sent to respond to particular calls. If these are the ones that have been shooting people in mental health, not doing so good. The city adopted a model of crisis intervention response that was based on the Memphis model and approved by the United States. Under this model, 911 dispatchers send specially trained officers to respond as primary officers to pre-identified calls, including certain suicide calls and other similar call types involving mental health crises. One of the concerns that was brought up, especially in the wake of Robert Delgado's killing in April was that the city's 911 system may not be properly evaluating and directing units for some of these calls. Hopefully, with the slow expansion of Portland Street Response and work like that, there might be improvements, but I'm too cautious to be positive about that right now. Then they do go on to say that the city recently implemented the Portland Street Response. So we do get to talk about that. Portland Street Response provides first responders trained in behavioral health, crisis intervention, and on-scene medical assistance to people who may be experiencing a mental health crisis or have a health concern that does not immediately threaten their lives. Portland Street Response's current team is staffed with a qualified mental health professional and a paramedic. While not required by the settlement agreement, Portland Street Response is an example of the city's commitment to change and service to community members. Maybe the court should try to require this and require it to have proper funding. This sixth section here, the court should give final approval to the stipulated agreements to sections 9 and 10 of the settlement agreement. In May 15th of 2018, this court conditionally approved the amended settlement agreement, except those paragraphs pertaining to community engagement and oversight. The city urges this court to formally recognize the excellent work of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing and fully approve the amendments. The city therefore renews its motion to approve these amendments. PCCEP has made a great deal of progress since the last status conference. During the summer of 2020, PCCEP held a handful of weekly listening sessions on Zoom to hear community reactions to the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests in Portland. Attendance at these listening sessions ranged from 100 to 300 people. These listening sessions resulted in recommendations to Portland Police, many of which were accepted by Portland Police. PCCEP formed a racial justice subcommittee where space was provided for people from differing racial identities to share their experiences with police. Like PCCEP's other committees, this subcommittee continues to meet monthly. Might be some question about how good they're doing in light of how little has actually changed on the local level with policing. That's, yeah. Also of note is PCCEP's Behavioral Health Subcommittee. Most members of this subcommittee are persons with lived experience. This subcommittee has formed relationships with Portland Police's Behavioral Health Unit, and they regularly meet to discuss ways that Portland Police's Behavioral Health Unit can better engage with individuals with lived experience. This is a small sampling of the critical work of the PCCEP during 2020, but reflects the importance of the committee itself, as well as the value of formal recognition by this court. And they go on to conclude, in 2020, the world, the nation, and the city of Portland face serious and significant issues, a pandemic that continues today, a demand for true racial justice, and prolonged demonstrations in Portland. The city of Portland, our nation, and our world must do better moving forward. The city is committed to doing so, both within the context of the settlement agreement with the United States and beyond. I just... You have to keep in mind that this entire document is the city trying to put themselves in the best light. They're not going to readily acknowledge when they're doing things wrong. So they're going to try to downplay the fact that the court has had to file restraining orders against their actions, both in federal and local courts, for violations of settlement agreement and laws. They're not going to want to bring up how no officers have faced any meaningful disciplinary actions for any of the actions taken during the protests. How any of the multitude of lawsuits against the city for injuries caused by the police are going to end up getting paid by the taxpayers, while the police officers get to hide behind their qualified immunity. It's just... it's going to be interesting to see what the Department of Justice has to say. I don't know that they're going to file a response to this, or if it'll just go into the hearing on Tuesday, provided that's still going on. I haven't gotten any updated word of any change to the court docket, but I also haven't received the information that I was expecting for how to listen in on Tuesday, so we're still keeping an eye out on that. So yeah, that is what I have here tonight. Thanks for the people that have tuned in. This is Heather Van Wild with Raindrop Works. If you want to support our work, there are links down in the description below to our website, as well as our Patreon and more direct support options. And yeah. This particular document that we went over tonight is also linked. It's the first link in the video description, so if you want to look at it yourself, definitely feel free to. It's publicly available through Court Listener. And stay safe. Try to protect each other. Ignore the dumpster in the background. And if you haven't gotten vaccinated, do it, please. I'm tired of being stuck at home all the time.